Hey everyone, today we're going to be talking about something that I know has been on a lot of people's minds lately, and that is how to make the transition between Adobe Premiere to DaVinci Resolve. This video is just about getting you up, ready to go, actually making the transition in just a small amount of time by kind of understanding the broad overview of how the UI is laid out, how things work a little bit. So with all those things in mind, let's go ahead and get started, and I'm going to teach you how to switch over from Adobe Premiere to DaVinci Resolve in one day. So before we actually start this video, I think it's pretty valuable to talk about why we made the transition as a business. If you already know the advantages to DaVinci Resolve out there and you're just a one-man band or you don't even care about this, just go ahead and click this time and then just skip in the video to move on. But the biggest reasons we switched were pricing, because I really don't like having to deal with subscriptions. I think it's annoying. If I'm gonna be paying into something, I really wanna own it. And then B, $300 for the entire studio version, which includes way more out of the box than Adobe Premiere actually does. And then number two, vastly superior performance. Just scrubbing through the timeline feels faster, everything just feels faster, and rendering is so much better on DaVinci Resolve. And I find that I'm not getting like random pop-ups in Media Encoder or like the native render that I used to get in Adobe Premiere. And then finally, number three, the program itself just packs so much of a feature set inside of such a small price point. For $300, you get noise reduction, Hollywood level color grading, film emulation, the Open Effects suite, Fairlight, like the best audio suite I've ever used in any editing program, Fusion. I mean, all of these things, you'd probably have to pay about like 50 to 70 bucks a month to even get a license that includes everything. And by that point, I mean, after a couple months, DaVinci Resolve will have paid for itself once over. Those are probably the biggest reasons. Let's go ahead and just move on to actually making the transition itself. Alright, so when you first open up DaVinci Resolve, you'll be greeted with the Project Manager. And in contrast to Adobe Premiere, where you can save all your project files in different locations, this is your one-stop shop for everything. The local disk database is probably the only one you're realistically going to use unless you start getting into bigger projects where you need to transition across external drives. Or one of the really compelling things that Resolve does do is you can build a server and then everybody can simultaneously chat and work on the same file remotely, which is great, especially with quarantine going on right now as I'm filming this. But for now, we're just gonna go ahead and right-click, make a new project. And another thing to take into account is that this database and these projects are always traveling together. So this local database here stores everything that you're ever going to make unless you happen to make a brand new database. But for now, let's just go ahead and call this test. We'll create that. So now we come to one of the most common frustrations that people have when they see the program, because it's new, it's different, unlike Adobe Suite, and that is the tab system on the bottom of the screen. So I'm gonna explain each one in detail on what it actually does, but you can think about each one of these tabs as similar to Adobe's Dynamic Link, just that much more integrated inside of the program itself. So with the leftmost tab, you're gonna have Media, which is your ingestion station for when you're doing DIT work, if you just got off your shoot, what have you. This is the place you wanna go to when you're going to start importing your footage. You can think of this, if you've ever used Lightroom, as your sort of first stop before you actually start editing. So you can do in and out points with the I and O keys, just review footage, see the metadata for bit depth, codec, frame rate, embedded audio channels. Anything like that is basically going to be where you adjust them before you actually start doing bigger things. So in our case, let's go ahead and just in and out some of this beautiful footage we have. This talking head interview. Wow, that's cinematic. All right, so then you can go ahead and select all the footage that you want. And then we're gonna import that into a media pool. And then you'll get a pop-up like this. I'm sure you're used to seeing something like this in Adobe Premiere, but our frame rate is different than the project frame rate. So these were shot at 23.967, and I think our project right now is defaulting to 24 FPS natively. So we're gonna go ahead and hit change, and you're gonna notice it imported all the footage. And then on the left here, you have your bins, just as you normally would. I'll go ahead and do house for our bin. And we'll just drag these pieces of footage into here because I don't want those to be in there. We'll also grab that And then, yep, that's still the house. That's just the front. Great, now we've kind of got a little bit of organization going on, so let's go to our cut page. Now the cut page is a little weird because not a lot of editing programs have an equivalent to this. I think Final Cut is the only one that has something similar. But if you're doing something that's super rapid fire, like a news cycle or a vlog you just need to get out ASAP, this is the first line of defense for preliminary editing for rapid delivery. If you do want to use this, it's basically just a dumbed down timeline for rapid delivery. You know, I can go ahead and import my footage into here on our video line, and you'll see that if you put something up against it, it will automatically move it, or you can actually overlap it. So if I move that, it just cuts it over. It's like a really dumbed down editing program, but it's very useful in the sense that if you do need to get something out ASAP, you know, you can just move all the way to the left here, do your basic tools. And the great thing about DaVinci Resolve, I want to make note real quick. But like I said, I generally don't use this. And if you want to look up the cut page in more detail, go ahead. But I'm going to move along in the video because I find that most people aren't actually going to use this for their workflow. This is the most popular page and the one where you're going to be doing 99% of your work. In the edit page, you will find that pretty much everything is pretty similar to Adobe Premiere, just laid out slightly differently. So if you notice here, you typically in Adobe Premiere have your keyframes for things like zooming, position, all of that, and the things that you normally expect like effects, sounds, your bins. They're all just kind of laid out differently. So to start with, one of the most common things, upper left corner, if you want to have the entire pane here take up this space, go ahead and use that to your liking. Your media pool is the same thing as Adobe Premiere. So where everything lives, your effects library is going to be where you have your transitions, your titles, your text, Fusion, anything that's like that. And we'll talk about Fusion later. That's their motion graphics After Effects equivalent. But in addition to that, you also have your audio effects, your VSTs. But to start with, we can also explore the edit index, which is basically a history of everything you've done, what track it's on, what channel it's on, source in and out, everything. This is very similar to the history tool in Photoshop. And then our sound library is if you have categorized audio, which you can actually download a free package from Blackmagic themselves. And then, as always, we have our regular viewing source monitor for the footage that we're currently looking at, and then our viewing monitor for the footage that we are having on our timeline. And then all the way on the right here, we have our mixer, which just shows audio. We have panning for left and right. We have mixer track volume. We also have mute solo, naming conventions, anything like that. We also have our metadata, which is very similar to the original media ingestion page and shows you everything about the video file. And then finally we have Inspector, which is probably the one you're most commonly going to use. So I'm going to expand that, and you'll notice here you have everything, the same keyframe layout, but the biggest advantage is that DaVinci Resolve also adds a couple things that I find more useful, such as dynamic zoom. If we check that, you'll see now that it's actually zooming in and out on the footage. You also have stabilization. You have 3 forms of it inside of DaVinci Resolve, and you'll find that one is probably going to be the most useful for your particular clip. But in our case, you can go ahead and stabilize it. It's way faster than Adobe Premiere. I mean, I just click on that, and I'm not waiting for hours for Warp Stabilizer to deal with the things it needs to do. And there we go. It's ready to go. Looks beautiful. And then you also have your retime and scaling if you want to do optical flow to fake slow motion, and lens correction if you have raw footage, or if you just have something like a fisheye lens that just needs to be changed a little bit. So that's really all there is to it in terms of the layout that's uncommon. You also have your tool set here, and for the most part, each one of these is also very similar. So let's double click. We want to put this talking head interview in here. So I'd always pretty much by default have the cursor selection mode on. You can also use the trim edit mode, which allows you to do, you know, slipping, sliding, anything like that, editing within the clip. So for instance, if I have a clip here that's really short and I go up against it and I really don't like the beginning, there's way too much sunlight in here, you can just hover over it and move it left and right, or you can expand it by going to the left or rightmost side. And then another thing too that is a little bit different about DaVinci Resolve but super useful, you have these visual cues here. On the left and right side, that green highlight tells you if you have footage that's remaining. If you go all the way to the right, that red means that you no longer have anything you can adjust. This is the dynamic tool. Go ahead and just do your own research on that if you want to use it. It's very useful. It's a much faster way of using shortcut keys to do what we just did with rolling and sliding editing. Then you also have your cutting tool, as you expect. Then you also have insert clip, overwrite clip, and replace clip, which pretty self-explanatory. You have this magnet here, which allows you to snap clips up against each other. Turn that off, you'll notice it no longer snaps. Pretty self-explanatory. The linked selection one means that as I select this, you'll notice that they kind of move in tandem. But if I unselect it, I can now move the audio independently, just like you would in Adobe Premiere. And then the position lock is pretty self-explanatory. It just locks things into place. And then you have your markers tool if you want to mark scenes, mark in-outs, mark music beds, anything like that. You also have your timeline view options. These are great if you want to adjust track heights or if you want to show more things on screen. Finally, the last thing I'm going to talk about inside of the editing page is the timeline selection. So timelines are very similar to the way you would actually use them in Adobe Premiere. Let's go ahead and right-click, create new timeline. We'll just call this test 2. And then if you want to use custom settings, I'm actually going to. Let's say I wanted to do an Instagram cut of this that was square. Whoops, we'll go ahead and make that 1080 by 1080. Set your frame rate. Mismatch resolution is an amazing tool. Go ahead and research what they do, but I tend to use scale full image to crop most of the time, which basically scales the image as large as possible in order to fill in all the blank space. So if we have this wide image, it will basically cut it out into a square automatically, and then you can adjust left and right positioning. So we've created that. Now you'll notice here we have our timeline selection tool. We have timeline 1 and test 2. So now I'm going to briefly talk about Fusion, which is DaVinci Resolve's answer to After Effects. And I'm not going to explain a lot of things in detail because this tool has such a steep learning curve. But it's extremely powerful. You can do 3D work, particles, VFX, anything you can do in After Effects, you can do inside of Fusion. It actually has a lot of very useful tracking tools for compositing, anything like that. So now I've gone ahead and placed one clip in our new timeline, test 2. I'm gonna go ahead and click on Fusion. And the first window you'll see is kind of intimidating in the fact that you've probably never seen another program like this when you do graphics or VFX work. That is because it is hierarchical. The media in is exactly as it sounds. This is the video we're looking at right here. And then this line all the way to media out is what's going to be composited at the end after everything in between is done. So the easiest way you can think about this is it's like a flowchart sort of showcasing everything that's being done in sequential order. So if we wanted to add text, for instance, you can go ahead and hit Shift Space, type in text, and then we'll just go ahead and add that. And you'll notice right now it doesn't actually show anything, nothing's on the viewfinder. We just got a bunch of these different settings here. But the great thing about Resolve and Fusion is that you can actually use these bubbles here to view anything that you're working on in whichever viewfinder you find most conducive to your workflow. So I'm gonna go ahead and hit the first one, and now you'll see that this text one is showing up in here. We'll go ahead and hit wow, crazy, and that's really it. So now you'll notice that it's still not on here, and even if I put it on here, it's not gonna do anything. That's because you need to merge things. Everything inside of Fusion needs to be merged on top of one another. And once you start getting into really complex, flowcharts, you'll find that this is so much more useful because that way you can more intuitively see what each one of these components is doing. But for now, we'll just go ahead and hit Shift Space, type in merge, and then we'll add it, and still nothing comes up. So what I would encourage you to do is to do your own research and kind of figure out when these arrows are most applicable to you, but the most common ones you're really going to use are these input ones on the left side and the output ones on the right side here. So if we just take the media one, we import it into this merge, and then we output that merge into media out. Now, right now, you'll see that these two are connected. It's taking that in, it's merging nothing right now because we have to take the output of this text into this merge one input, and you'll see that green line has put that wow crazy text on top. So that's as far as I'm gonna go. If you really do wanna learn Fusion, I'd encourage you to do so. It's great to use as a program for really anything, but it's got a very steep learning curve, and I find that you're really only going to be using a lot of these common tools here. So now we're going to talk a little bit about the color grading tab, which is DaVinci Resolve's biggest strength and why a lot of people are actually going to this program. Now the great thing about it is that the node system on it is vastly superior to stacking adjustment layers or multiple Lumetri colors or anything like that, because by default it's put on all the clips, it handles color better, it's more granular if you want to do smaller adjustments, and it also just has the ability to do so much more if you're trying to narrow down, certain portions of your image, or if you want to do tracking to just color grade certain portions. But without further ado, let's go ahead and talk about one of DaVinci Resolve's best features, the color tab. So when you first open it, we now have our clip here called Wow Crazy. I'm gonna go ahead and just zoom in a little bit and go back to timeline 1. And we're going to see this big interface with a bunch of different things coming at us, but fear not, it's actually very easy to use. And the great thing about it is everything is basically just spread out to have its own panel. This isn't really any different than Lumetri color. So now I'm going to show you the layout of where everything is, and then we're going to briefly color grade a clip real quick. But before, you have your gallery in here. This is perfect if you actually want to share grades. The difference between sharing grades in Lumetri color versus DaVinci Resolve is there is a tool called Power Grade, which saves all the adjustments in here that you do, and you can actually distribute those. Or more often than not, you'll probably want to showcase a grade you've done, so you can just right click at any time, grab a still, and now we have a still in here. You can go ahead and export that or export it with the display LUT, but that also allows you to share it as a JPEG or a PNG if you're trying to share it to Facebook or just do some screen grabs for a client. Then we also have our LUT selection, and in here it's pretty self-explanatory. The great thing about it is you can easily just go through and hover over and kind of move left to right to see what things might look like. You don't have to futz around with just going through a massive list or browsing for LUTs and just kind of being like, oh, what do I want to pick today? So in our case, I'm fine with this. This LUT was already embedded. And you can also go to the media pool if you want to explore other clips. And when you click on timeline, this is just a visual representation of where things are laid out. So we have our video track 1. That's the only thing we have in here because we only have this clip in the actual timeline. So on the right side here is the super fun part, nodes. So the great thing about nodes is they're actually surprisingly easy to understand. You can think of these like layers inside of an image editing program, and the most common ones we're really going to use are just layers on top of other layers, which are called serial nodes. You can right click and see all the different kinds. You have serial afterwards, which means it's another layer on top of this to make adjustments. Serial before, which is before that. Then you have more complex ones like parallel, layer, and an outside one. 90% of the time, you're probably only going to be using serial. So let's go ahead and add a serial node, and now you'll see that this line is extended because our source image has gone from here into here and then across the chain down. The blue ones, I'm not going to really go into detail too much right now, but those are actual alpha ones. If, say, you had a green screen key that you were doing, you can actually input the alpha and output it to another portion of the program. Go ahead and do your research on those. Those are great if you're doing chroma keying, for instance, but for now, let's just go ahead and grade. So this clip, I like it, but I don't know. Let's say it's just too warm right now. We're going to actually go down here and look at our primary wheels. You have our lift, gamma, gain, offset, and again, do your research on what these things actually do in the manual. But you have 2 pages here, and then you also have all the most common ones: contrast, your pivot, your saturation, your hue, and your mix. But 2 is really where you're probably going to be using most of the tools, and that is for things like temperature adjustment. In our case, I'm going to make this just a little bit cooler. Let's go down to like, I don't know, -250. That looks pretty good. That looks pretty neutral. Tint, red, green, pretty self-explanatory. Now, mid-tone detail is very useful if you're doing a grade where you've raised the shadows up and you find that everything is just too sharp. This is basically to blur it, but in a sense, not blur it. I find that the only time I'm ever really using this tool is, like I said, if I'm doing something where there's an insane amount of dynamic range and I've pulled up our shadows. And then color boost is sort of a non-destructive version of saturation that will boost the colors but not saturate every single part of the image. And then shadows and highlights are pretty self-explanatory, so let's just go ahead and boost that. And I like that. But if you do not like that and you kind of want to compare it to the image, just go ahead and hit Control D, or if you're on a Mac, I'd assume Command D. So now let's move on to our second grade, and you'll notice this little icon has appeared here. That means we've adjusted things inside of these sections here. And now we're going to use the 3D qualifier tool. You have HSL here, which is just another way of grabbing color. You'll notice nothing's happening. In order to see what you're grabbing, go ahead and hit Shift H. All these gray bits here are the things I haven't selected. So if I use my mouse to scroll in and just pick that flower, the only thing that's going to be affected are these little orange bits. And you can go ahead and change the center, the width, everything you normally would in 3D, in other color picking tools to get as accurate of a qualifier as you want. But these ones are present in most programs. Where DaVinci Resolve really shines is the 3D color picker tool. So 3D color picker tool is a way for you to drag across something, and it will kind of fill in the blanks and assume what it thinks you want to pick, and it actually does a really good job. So if I just draw along this orange pillow here, then I hit Shift H, it's selected most of the pillow and a lot of the other orange things in here, but go ahead and change our selection range to subtractive, and then we can just draw all over the things we don't want. Denoise it just a little bit, and then just go ahead and hit Shift H again, and you'll see here now we have this red tool that's telling us don't select this tan couch, don't select, these sort of orangish flames over here, and you'll see all these little paths here. Now everything that I do is only going to be affecting this region here. So, you can even do like tint if you're like, I don't like that orange pillow, let's make it a little more blue. Whatever you feel is appropriate. So the node system on here, the biggest advantage, like I said earlier, is that say you don't like this grade at all. I hate this grade. You can go ahead and add a node corrector just in the middle of everything, and then just change your input and your output. And now we've completely gone back to the way we were before, and I can just save this grade over here, or I can rename these things to just be something later if I'm like, maybe the client doesn't like it, what have you. But I'm going to go ahead and delete both of these nodes. Right-click, delete node. Right-click, delete node. All right, so now we're back to square one, and I'm going to briefly go over some of the tools. So we have our raw panel here if you have Blackmagic Raw, Red Code, Canon Raw, Color Match if you have color charts, our primary wheels, which we went over a little bit. And then we have an RGB mixer if we want to change our output levels. We also have our motion effects for things like noise reduction, motion blur if you want to add even more motion blur to a clip, curves, pretty self-explanatory. You can change the type of curves by going into the upper right corner here. Our qualifier picking tool, our window tool. Now this is great if you just want to put something over here and only highlight something. Say you only want to adjust a sign or some text. If I hit Shift H, now everything in this gray area is not going to be included. So now that little box there, if I go back and I just adjust highlights, you'll see right now that it really only just is adjusting this window here. But let's go ahead and undo all that. We also have our tracking window if I want to track a shape to something. So say I want to track this coaster, I can actually make a square, make that just a hair smaller with each corner. Let's go ahead and zoom in. There we go. Then you can go to the tracking page, go all the way to the beginning. Let's actually reset that location. Then we'll just track it forward. And it actually does a really good job of picking up on the details that I'm only trying to affect. You'll notice it went a little bit off, but that's probably because my square is a little bit, wonky. But now if I just, shadows and highlights, it's only going to affect that region here. If I go ahead and hit Shift H, same concept, but let's go ahead and undo all that. And then you also have your sharpness and blur tool if you want to just increase that, blur, more blur, less blur, pretty self-explanatory. And it does an okay job of its sharpening algorithm. I find it's pretty good if you want to do things for raw footage. Keying, if you have a node on top of another node, you can actually adjust how much of those blend together. You also have your sizing for things like panning, tilting, zoom, rotation, If you just want something that's fixed and you're not keyframing it, this is another way to do it. And then you also have your 3D tools, which honestly I've never used because I don't do a lot of 3D footage. And then you also have your keyframes here, where if you really wanted to keyframe, I don't know, your grade or your noise reduction. For instance, let's say you had a scene where you're walking outdoors and indoors, and then all of a sudden you're adjusting aperture. You can go ahead and keyframe your noise reduction, add another one. You know, let's just do that real quick. We'll go to noise reduction and we'll just up this a little bit to crazy noise reduction. It looks blotchy, totally unusable, but for our purposes, you'll be able to see it. Go to the end, and now you'll just see it go from that back to our original image. Well, that's mostly the color tool in terms of what you're actually going to be doing for grading. Now let's talk about effects a little bit. Open effects are built on a platform that's pretty universal. They are all GPU based for the most part, but you'll see here you have tons of different things. So just like Adobe Premiere, you have your list of effects. You just drag that on a node, and you'll notice you get the little effects icon, and you can just go ahead and adjust what you want. You have your keyframes here, and now you also have your corrector, and at the very bottom you now have a new plugin called Box Blur that you can keyframe. And likewise, everything on here can be adjusted independently. I find that it's easiest though to organize them as if you were doing them independently. That doesn't mean though you can't just adjust shadows and highlights and saturation and everything on one channel. It's just going to add more icons. You know, now we have sharpness levels and our open effects on here. But now if I need to do more, you know, specific adjustments, everything's going to be consolidated, and I personally don't like that. I like having them split. So we're going to undo all of that and now talk about Fairlight. Fairlight is DaVinci Resolve's complete audio editing and mixing platform. And unlike a lot of other video editing programs that I've personally used, it's really powerful, and it's about as close as I've ever found to a true DAW inside of an editing program. It has VST support, so you can use third-party plugins, great for ADR, sound library support with keyword tagging, elastic audio if you want to stretch, shrink, or do whatever. So all the manipulation that's available to you within Fairlight is vastly superior to not only Adobe Premiere, but I think pretty much any other program on the market today. So I'll briefly talk about how to use it, and let's go ahead and get started with Fairlight. Before we go ahead and fully open it up, I'm going to import a clip that I know has dialogue inside of it. So we have our interview here. I'm going to shave off that, you know, zoom out a little bit. And by the way, if you don't know the zoom out shortcut key, it's Control plus and minus. So let's go about to, I don't know, there. That seems like a good point. We'll turn on the snapping tool, move that up against our clip, and zoom in a little more. And that looks like a good point where we have usable dialogue. Now we're going to open up Fairlight. And you'll see the video has been moved up to here, and we lost all of our tracks except the audio. And if you've ever used any other audio editing program, this should seem pretty familiar to you. You have your selection tool to move regions around. You also have a dedicated one to select only certain portions of the audio to loop. You also have a trim tool that trims where the playhead is if you want to splice the media up. We're going to undo all of that and undo our selection. And in addition to that, we also have our metering in the top corner here that you can adjust on and off. We also have our mixer, just like our video editing suite, metadata to see what codec we have down here. And then also if you turn on Inspector, you will have things you can automate, which is very similar to Adobe Premiere. So if you wanted to automate panning, for instance, you can start here, click your keyframe, go over to here, go all the way to the right, and now you'll see that it is automatically doing that panning. The other thing that's really nice is the one thing you're pretty much always going to use on all clips is equalizers, and that's just built in default. You can turn that on. You can do a high pass, low pass, band EQ if you want to boost the highs, boost the mids, cut the mids, do whatever you want that you'd normally expect from an audio editing suite. So I'm going to turn that off. You can also change pitch and automate each and every single one of these. So you can additionally put on effects, and I find that the built-in ones are actually halfway decent, unlike Adobe Premiere. So, you know, you have your limiter, modulation, pitch, reverb, a bunch of other things. The most common one you're probably going to use is vocal channel, and you can just put that directly on the clip. But in lieu of that, I find it's most effective, especially if you've done a shoot where you've recorded with the same microphones or audio setup each time, to put it on the entire track if you just drag it into one of these blank spaces. And now you'll see in our mixer we have a vocal channel on track 1 throughout the entire project. So you have EQ, you know, same as before, high pass, high, we're gonna boost those highs. Then you also have a nice little compressor here, you know, you can brick wall it if you want. Not a very useful real world scenario, but it's just kind of showing you how it works. Then you can also use your VST effects if you want to. I happen to have a bunch of ozone things in here installed on this particular editing workstation. And then you also have your transitions for crossfades. And just like pretty much every other part of DaVinci Resolve, you have most of what you're gonna be using in the upper left corner, including your media pool, your editing history index, your sound library, and your ADR tools. From there, you can also expand and contract the heights, adjust things to your liking. We can, however, I'll briefly show you elastic audio. So if I want to make a cut here, move my playhead, hit the cut tool, delete that. And then we right click on it and actually I'm going to say shave off just a little bit more. We'll cut that portion, delete that. Then we'll go to the clip and hit elastic wave. And now you'll notice that all the tools change and you can actually stretch the track or shrink it, and it will just automatically refine that to the distancing. You know, you can do that as many times as you want. You know, say you wanted to make another new clip, now you have another new elastic audio, just anything like that. And it's super useful if you have ADR work that you're trying to do where you're trying to sync up voiceovers and you find that you're just positioning things, kind of cutting out portions. This is a lot more graceful and it generally does a pretty good job of not introducing digital artifacting, but your mileage may vary. So now we're on to our final portion of this tutorial, and that is the delivery page. And if you've ever used something like Adobe Media Encoder or even its default rendering mode, this is pretty self-explanatory. It's just the same thing you would normally use to send out final footage, whether you want to render it out directly to another device, or the thing about DaVinci Resolve is it does have some native integration with things like YouTube or Frame.io. But aside from that, there's not much else you can really do with it aside from just encode your clip into one deliverable file. But let's go ahead and talk briefly about the delivery page and how to properly use it. So for all intensive purposes, let's just say this was our final edit and ready to go. Go ahead and hit deliver. And you'll see here a couple different things pop up. You're going to have what's called your render settings, which is the same on pretty much any other program out there for editing. Like I said before, you do have your native integrations with YouTube, Vimeo, and then normally you can also add ones here if you want to do like Frame.io or a couple other utilities. But in our case, you're probably just going to do H.264 and maybe upload it to YouTube. Click on any of the presets, or if you choose to, you can also build a custom one from scratch. And then just scroll down and you'll see everything you need to adjust, such as the resolution, frame rate, codec, format, encoder, anything you'd ever want to change to your heart's content. And in addition to that, you can also select an in and out range. Let's say we just wanted this portion of the dialogue, so I can go ahead and hit O, and it will only render this portion here. This is extremely useful for, say you want to have one timeline with a bunch of different projects contained within the same timeline. Then you just kind of want to bounce those back and forth, or say there's a clip on the very end that you're saving for something and you don't want that to be included in the final render. But we're going to go ahead and hit H.264 master and scroll up to the top. This is the part that is a little bit different also, in that the file name and the location structure is kind of weird. So if you go to File here, you'll notice that you have a timeline name, which you can just use to match. In our case, it would just name it Timeline 1 because we never named our initial timeline. Or if you want to do custom name, then you can go ahead and just input the location by hitting Browse. And then we could just call this you know, final export v1. Then you'll see here it automatically fills in the location and the file name. Go ahead and hit add to render and then just hit start render. Now one thing that is also different is that you need to actually select the render. So for instance, if I had a bunch of different jobs queued up, it's only going to render this one unless you actually either multiple select them by holding Control, or if you're on a Mac, whatever the applicable key is. Or you can also just click off, hit on one, and then hold Shift, and then select all of them. But be aware if you're out there and you're working a late night edit and all of a sudden you're like, man, I need to deliver 5 different variations in different timelines, and you just add those all and you do not select them all, it's going to only render one of those clips. Extremely important. So I know we didn't cover a lot of very specific things inside of this video. That's because it would be impossible for me to really create an entire summation of this editing program in the amount of time that you'd really want to watch. Later down the line, we're hoping to have a full workshop program, but for the time being, we want to know what you think. Is there anything specific that's still super confusing about the transition, or just Adobe Premiere, DaVinci Resolve in general? What I encourage you to do is kind of make the transition over time. Maybe spend the next month or two just taking your personal projects into this program, then bumping up to client projects, and then kind of having a good crossroad point where you think, is this program right for me, and am I ready to fully convert? That's exactly what we did, and eventually after about 2-3 months, we finally made the conversion over to do all of our projects inside of it and couldn't be happier. The problem is with practice, you're only going to get better, and you need to actually take the time to move those editing projects in there. You can't just waste time saying, oh, eventually I'll do it, oh, eventually I'll pick it up. You need to force yourself to put yourself into those situations where you need to ask questions. And if you have any questions about those programs or anything specific about these programs, make sure to hit up the comment section below so we can either explore it, help you with it, make a tutorial on it. And if you like videos like this, make sure to support our channel by liking, comment, subscribing this video, and hitting the bell icon to be notified of all of our future works. But until then, make sure to follow us on all of our social media platforms, including skyfeatherstudios.com for the latest in industry news. And until then, we'll see you guys next time.